We're now live.
We're now live.
It's real. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Bibliomancy for Beginners. This is a monthly book club where usually 3 people chat about books. Tonight it will be Taylor and I. Gretchen had a very tough day today, so she decided to opt out of the meeting, but wishes us well.
Mm-hmm. We're also normally monthly, but are not, so... have some pity on us, guys. It's hard.
Classic. The real trick will be trying to get us to actually do Smoke Gets in Your Eyes the last week of this month. Do you think we can do it? Because it's a shorter book than this.
Yeah, because Moby Dick is a shorter book than this, you mean?
I mean, yeah. So that's the real trick. If you did not know, we do have a Goodreads group, which I will have linked down below in the YouTube video, as well as the information on the podcast site, discussing which books we are planning to read and when we're planning to have the live discussions. Obviously, as this is an example of, we do not always have things go to plan, as this has been postponed twice now. And if that is the case, you should follow either the Bibliomancy Twitter or our individual Twitters, also linked down below, where we will notify folks of changes. Yes?
Yeah.
Okay. Do we need to introduce ourselves?
Who are you?
I'm Michaela. Who are you?
I'm Taylor.
Whoa.
That was easy.
Usually there's a Gretchen, but we don't have a Gretchen. For today, we read We the Drowned by Carsten Jensen. It is translated by 2 people, if I'm not wrong.
I actually have no idea.
The Goodreads page had them linked, but I don't think that, anywhere.
Yes, translated by Charlotte Barsland with Emma Ryder.
There you go.
Actually in the inner cover, so we're actually just kind of lazy for not noticing that.
Well, on mine it's only visible, it's not on the inner cover, it's only visible in the information about the book in the Library of Congress stuff. That's the only place in my edition that has that listed.
Interesting, because we visually have the same edition, but no matter. Good job on those 2.
Yep.
Shall I read the back of the book?
Yeah, it's your pick. Why not? Go for it.
An international bestseller, a thrilling epic tale of the sea. Hailed in Europe as an instant classic, We the Drowned is the story of the port town of Marstal, Denmark, whose inhabitants sailed the world from the mid-19th century to the end of the Second World War. The novel tells of ships wrecked and blown up in wars, of places of terror and violence that continue to lure each generation. There are cannibals here, shrunken heads, prophetic dreams, and miraculous survivals. The result is a brilliant seafaring novel, a gripping saga encompassing industrial growth, the years of expansion and exploration, the crucible of the first half of the 20th century, and most of all, the sea.
True.
I feel like we need a dramatic horn blare at the end with the sea.
And the sea gets one of those thunder sheets that they had in elementary school.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Okay.
Or the guy in that one classical piece with the really big mallet.
Yep. That guy. You know that guy. He had a huge role in No Turkey for Perky, if I recall correctly. That classic Thanksgiving play that all first graders must put on. I have actual photos of my first grade class having performed No Turkey for Perky, and I was the turkey. I had a headband on that had the turkey feather hand thing.
A historic story, the tale of America, much like We the Drowned, on topic, is a story of not only the age of sail coming to a close, but of many parts of history and Marstal, Denmark. I'm trying to salvage this from Perky the Turkey, Michaela.
There's no coming back from Perky the Turkey. And Perky is a dog, by the way.
What?
Yeah, so it's a Thanksgiving.
Don't explain it. Don't explain it.
Just know it's a play, and first graders did it, so it was terrible. Yes, so normally the way that we start is with our spoiler-free overall impressions, but because this is a book club, we will get into more detail and talk about the actual characters and events of the novel. If you do not wish to be spoiled, just listen to this first bit, go read the book and come back, or listen to the whole thing and be sad, or just don't care about being spoiled and then listen to the whole thing and then go read the book and be happy.
There's a fair argument that, knowing the events of a book before you read it, or like seeing a movie, doesn't actually impact your enjoyment of it. So don't worry about listening to spoilers.
There is that, but there are, like, if we were, this book I don't think can be spoiled, but if we were reading like a mystery book and we talked about the ending, I feel like that does affect your enjoyment of the novel in a way.
But we will have a spoiler warning, so...
Correct. Again, I don't think that anything that we're going to talk about is actually going to spoil this book, because there's no real, like, it's not about that. It's not.
In the mid-20th century, there was this really big war.
Whoa, what?
And in the early 20th century, there was another really big war.
Whoa, what?
And then in the mid of the 19th century, there was a really big, much, actually... smaller war.
Quite small war.
There were like 3 boats in it, and that was it.
And yep.
So now we got spoilers out of the way.
Yep, it happens. Yeah. I guess I'll go first since we don't have a Gretchen. I said this on Goodreads that I completely understand the beauty in this book, and there were moments in it that were incredibly moving and incredibly powerful, and other moments that were quite funny. Notably the first line of this book. It's a very good first line, and it captured me, and I do appreciate that, and part of that is hats off to the translators for being able to capture that, and part of that I'm hoping is the actual writing that the author did as well. But I had issues that stemmed in different ways throughout the book that made it kind of like I wanted more from it, and it didn't quite meet my expectations. That isn't to say that I disliked it. I just wanted more from it. And because there were those like niggling little things that kept bugging me, I couldn't like give it more than the 3.5 stars. I think I would go with 3.5 because it wasn't like mediocre, but it also wasn't like 4-star happy to have read this book type books.
All right.
Is that fair?
So I really enjoyed this book. Like, it wasn't, if we're going to go by the stars, it wasn't a 5-star book for me because, well, like you said, there were ups and downs. There were some parts that I really enjoyed. I mean, this is spread over 100 years, 3 main characters, many minor characters, and a wide variety of literary traditions and focuses. So I feel like in that sort of situation, there's always going to be things you latch on to more than others. And while all those moments do come together in their own ways, not all of them are ones that I necessarily enjoyed. So I'm aware of some of the issues you had with it. And while I don't necessarily share them and I see them as issues, I think they're also very good points for discussion, in that I should say I think they're issues, but I don't necessarily think this book could have or really should have dealt with them all the time. I think they're just larger things that bother us. I don't know. I'm completely rambling and things we can't actually get into without going into the spoiler section for the most part. So
we should move on.
Maybe, but overall, I really enjoyed this. I found the history fascinating, even though this is sort of fictionalized version of the general events that happened to this town. I found it to be really interesting to go through, and reminded me of a lot of stories that I also enjoyed. So even where this was weak, it was making me think of bringing up ideas and memories that I was engaging with.
I agree. For sure. It is a very well written, very complex novel. And a lot of the things that I really liked about it were in its writing. In particular, like, okay, so the title sort of alludes to this fact, but the title being We the Drowned, there are moments throughout the text where this like weird omniscient narrator takes so many different amorphous forms.
Yes, like the first third of the book especially
in the beginning, which I found really quite interesting because it made it seem like we had discussed in novels like The Virgin Suicides, and that you and I discussed in our class on Toni Morrison of communal narratives, which is what this is. Because it is not so much a plot oriented book as it is a character focus, and it's really at its heart supposed to be a study of this one town and the inhabitants of it and the effects that those inhabitants had on the wars that were happening and the effects the wars had on the inhabitants back and forth. Although writing it from that omniscient,
it does in some ways claim to be the direct line of the original character Lords Madsen, like the male line, but that's in itself hazy and doesn't always stay true to that. So no. Sorry, I really interrupted there.
No, it's okay. Because it does focus on him and his family and sort of like his ultimate effect on the whole town that is there, based on his impressions on his son, who becomes, I would say, the one that we followed the most.
Yeah, like I'd say close to half the book.
Yeah.
For Albert Madsen.
Even if we're not like directly looking at him, which we are for most of it, he is still mentioned in like the very beginning when he's a young boy, and at the end when we sort of switch off to his pseudo son, not really son.
Well, it's also just that we get his full life, whereas we get the end of, well, we get like maybe half of Loredz, half of Nud Eriksson. We get the whole length of Albert, which when we start thinking of the history, I think was also very interesting because he spanned the end of this golden age of sail into the post World War I industrialized story. So he definitely took the weight of this transition.
And in that way, he was much more of an interesting character because we got to see him grow and develop a lot more than we really got to see from any of the other characters, I would feel like. Yeah,
definitely.
And I was a little bit sad about that because there were other characters that I found like I wanted to know more about them, and we weren't given the same time or like stuff. Like even just Loredz in the beginning was a fucking weirdo, and I wanted to know more about him.
He was such an enigma in this story because we get really into the experiences and choices of everyone else, but Loredz is, no one can really understand him in his life when we see him, and then he just
disappears, literally disappears, and we don't really know whether he's dead, alive, what.
And that happens twice.
Twice, yeah. So
it was really hard because that was also the most interesting time period for me. That last quarter, especially, although the last half, I suppose, of the 19th century was the most interesting to me for various reasons. But it was so hard to get into his actual experience in it.
Which is just,
yeah.
So yeah, despite this book being about how he really started a weird chain of events that continued for 100 years, we didn't know much about him. we didn't get to see him for very long, and then he was gone, and all that we had were these like weird bits of character. Yeah.
Like
he saw some shit, and then he was gone.
Which I suppose is fair, because we'd say, oh, I really would have liked to understand more of his experience, but at the same time, he kind of continues on like this saint of the town, where he's created like this divine legend of himself from the original, in which the line you pointed out, which drew me to the book originally, which is, many years ago there lived a man called Lorenz Madsen who went up to heaven and came down again thanks to his boots. And the event is he's on a ship, it explodes, launches him up into the sky. He claims he met St. Peter, who bared his ass at him and sent him down to Earth again. And he walked to land along the bottom of the ocean shore.
Yeah.
And it's the most surreal part of the story. Because you just have like 20 people telling the story around him, whereas even while we're supposed to be following him,
he just kind of nods and like doesn't actually elaborate more than that at all.
So his story and his boots, like these items that these relics are passed down in the story. So even like Albert, his son, spends the whole time trying to figure it out. So it does make a very telling part of trying to understand these father figures in a town where the men so often don't come back.
Yeah. They're drowned. We drowned. There you go. Full circle.
That's what this book's about.
Yeah.
It's death and tradition and trying to understand it and being really angry at the sea.
Yeah.
That Xerxes analogy.
But also loving the sea and pining for it.
Not having a choice in the sea.
Do you want to talk about the boots? Because
talk to me about the boots.
I wasn't sure if they were trying to be like almost a magical realism element, or if it was just a coincidence, because those boots outlive like everybody.
Well, they're just well kept. They're probably pretty smelly and grangy at the end, but I assume a leather boot can be maintained well enough.
I suppose.
If it's like caked in, waterproofing as they would have been.
But these boots survived explosions, melting, being fully submerged in the ocean. And the idea that's given is that those boots, for whatever reason, are like a security thing, like a lucky charm of this family.
Well,
and they keep the men alive, because Lorenz doesn't disappear until he forgets to take his boots along, and then he's gone and possibly dead, and then Albert wears them and he survives his many adventures out in the ocean, getting struck in heads.
Yeah, we'll talk about that whole section, but I think it's set up in a way that it can be really easy to read as this book's one or two moments of magical realism.
Yeah.
But it's also it's such a vague fluke. It could be, yeah, dude just got hella lucky, and the town just understood this as something much larger, so they made these boots into something more than they were.
Yeah.
There's openness for that, but as you say, they become a charm for the family. We talk about luck a lot in the final section during World War II, and they're like, well, the ship was really lucky, but at the same time, we were just, we took care of the ship, and it was full of bullet holes when we got it. That's not exactly lucky when the entire crew was Swiss cheesed. So
that's fine. They're
it's
fine.
What the boots meant to the people, Michaela.
It is. They are
town exist.
They are the Holden Caulfield hunting cap of semen.
Yeah.
Sure. So yeah, that was one of the things that sort of piqued my interest, so to speak, were those boots and like how were they magic or were they just like
I think you're worrying too much about the boots, Michaela.
I don't know. No, I know, but like that's what I'm saying, was like they came up enough that I took notice of it and wanted to see if you thought that. Like, I don't honestly think that they are magic. Like, I don't think they are. I think they are just lucky, but because these characters seem to believe in them, perhaps there was an element of that. I don't know.
Yeah, you know, whether it was actually lucky or magical or not doesn't actually change what it meant to those characters and how it influenced them. So,
right. Okay. Do you have
so I guess
something?
we're stepping into the spoiler territory.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Now.
Spoils.
So how do you want to break this down? Because we can kind of go section by section, or do we want to keep it a little more vague and dip in where we want to?
I feel like I'd rather it be more organic than that, because like
Okay.
The book is structured in that way, that it has 4 sections, I think, like
yes,
pretty evenly. And all of those sections will follow a bunch of different characters for different reasons and are meant to show different things about the society and about the time period. I guess one of the things that I wrote about in complaints, if we're going to talk about the shrunken head thing, because it's interesting, was the I have issues with the portrayal of any sort of native culture as savages, and part of that being because I've had so many classes in my anthropology degree that were discussing the viewpoint of native peoples, people of color, as lesser, as more animalistic, just inherently, to like a more white culture, which this is. They're Nordic. They're like probably the whitest people you can get at, except the British.
Until you get, you know, the Sami and the Eskimos.
Yes, but
which are part of. Yeah, I'm being pedantic here. I understand. Yes.
And I mentioned in my review that I understand that it was set in a time period where that's words like that and discussions like that would be made. And
the
it was
South Seas were the center of colonial empire. So yeah.
I completely understand that, but I do also feel like a modern novel like this needs to, like in some way, rectify the way that we used to think, and I don't think it did.
How would you recommend changing it?
There were a lot of times where the narrative or the narrator people would make comments on the time period as if it was the past tense. We did, and like just one line that was like somehow giving more substantial. I don't even know how to say it. I don't know how to do it because it was so ingrained the way that they were looking at another culture in this. But like something needs to be said to be like, this was thought and it's not actually true. Like somebody needs to make a point of saying that like they aren't savages somehow, either like one of the characters having a moment of humanity being shown, something like that would balance out.
You don't feel like there were those moments?
Not enough to balance out, I guess. I don't know.
I'm not really sure how you would recommend measuring it. I'm not trying to be critical here. I understand, and I've read at least a handful of novels or short stories set in this time period, set in this region. And so these are ideas I'm totally on board with you about. So there are, even saying native is, in, more of an anthropological discourse, very condescending.
Yeah.
It's why, indigenous peoples, I think, is the accepted one, just because native is so bogged down
with the idea
that
yeah.
history. Yeah.
I think part of it is also that's indigenous is such a, like, it means native, it just doesn't have the connotation.
Yeah.
Like,
And I mean, exactly. We get that for a lot of things where proper terms get, turned into less positive vernacular. It's used insultingly, so they need to say, okay, we're going to use a new word now.
Yeah.
And down the line we go.
Yeah.
So yes, I guess indigenous cultures is really is trying as technically as possible to say they just lived here for a long time. That's all it means.
They were here. Yes. So, and I also mentioned when I reviewed this on Goodreads, when I discussed this, that this was like a very personal issue. Like, it just niggled at me, and I can understand if it didn't bother other people. Even it, like, I could see that there were, I don't know. Again, I like understood why it was there and how it was done. It just bothered me. Like, does that make sense?
So I agree with you in that this is a tricky thing to, a tricky line, because on one hand, it is trying to convey that historical perspective where it's like, okay, these are the ways they lived, here's how they were perceived by people, here's what a colonial structure looked like. So on the surface, it does, I think, succeed in showing that, but it's definitely bogged down through a lot of language, and definitely Albert Madsen's very biased perspective. Like, he even has that section where he's wound up being the captain of the ship with 4 or 5 black men. I think they were Samoan, maybe?
I think so, yeah.
And he spends the entire time, paranoid and fearful and thinking them animals who are going to kill him any chance he gets. And, at the end, the most humanizing thing is, like, they go through that storm and they don't kill him, and then they kind of shake hands at the end. And then hindsight, he was like, wait, they were telling me their names.
Nice.
I thought they were just, just saying words at me.
Weird.
So, no, it definitely has those awkward times of, like, this is very clearly a biased narrator, and it's sometimes hard to parse an actual perspective on it. If I get into my own feelings, because I was thinking a lot of Robert Louis Stevenson's The South Sea Tales, which is a collection of, I think, 4 or 5 short stories. And that's he wrote them in 1894. I just touched up on some of the stories before we did this, because it's like, we are talking about this, I'd like to know a little bit more. So that was roughly the same time. And it's, some of them are set in, like, Tahiti and, the same region. And the reason that those stories stood out so much to me is because they are very much anti-colonial books. I mean, he lived on those islands in the end of his life. Died there, and he was very, he cared a lot about the cultures and the people. And that's not something the system was really trying to do. So these stories were very much about, microcosms of the colonial structure, in which very incompetent white people are trying to carry out these industries where the indigenous populations are pretty much working autonomously. Like, yes, there are labor there, but they're doing their own thing despite these greedy idiots. And so that's not something we see very much in this book.
No.
It's not trying to do that. It's the story of, sailors passing through these towns. But I think it was interesting in showing how this was a place where everyone who wasn't happy in their own, you know, so-called civilized world ran away to. It was off the map and you could just get lost. And so it was kind of this, I found it interesting when looking at it as this symbol of the edges of the map have been filled in, Europe and America. The Atlantic is simple crossing now, and all those. And this is the last bit of magic, despite it being, when you get there, a lot of white guys trying to get you killed for their own profit. Like, send you down after smugglers, and then you doing these, and oh yeah, I just provided these shipwrecked slaves with guns so they have war games whenever I show up. And so it still felt like a very cynical look at these structures that have been implemented, but we still don't actually understand those people who actually lived there and would continue to live there. We never get that resolution of understanding.
No. Yeah. I'd never read those sea stories that you did, but
No, you didn't.
I did read Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad last summer.
One I haven't read. Yeah.
And that one's a teeny tiny book, which I'm sure you could fly through if you really wanted to. And that section in particular really reminded me of like Heart of Darkness, which is about a guy on a ship going down, I believe, the Congo, and it was very anti, like,
he's like, this is a bad thing, guys.
Yes, guys, we should not be doing this. These people are people, and this is bad.
Especially because that was Dutch, the Dutch Congo.
I think so. Right? Yes.
Or Belgium.
Something like that.
It was Belgium. Sorry, I need to stop dragging the Netherlands into this. It was the Belgian Congo. That was horrific.
Yes. And I think that might be why this bugged me, is because my only other experience of a narrative like this, I don't often read narratives that take place in this time period or in this area. And those that I have are very strongly against everything that was going on. And while this had like an against it bias, it wasn't in the same way, which led me feeling like there needed to be more said here.
It's still only a part of the book, and then it's just dropped. We never come back to this place. We go everywhere else and see it change, but this is just a moment. So I think there was a lot of interesting stuff going on, but we don't always get that full look. Although, speaking of Heart of Darkness, we do have later on, I guess in the third chapter, when Albert Madsen's older, and he is talking to that fellow from Marstal, who comes back from having worked in the Congo for his entire adult life, who came back feeling very differently about it. He's like, I was a god there. I was never more alive than when I was cutting people's hands off and living as a man does.
Manly man.
Yeah, so I think that's our one moment to really look back on all that stuff.
Yeah.
And see how differently these characters branched off and internalized those experiences. So even though the book doesn't take the time to...
I think it does have to do with the power dynamic, though, right? Because like that guy was at the top of the power chain in this way, whereas in a lot of...
just a boatman.
But he still had way more power than...
Well, okay, sure. He fully bought into the political system and was a part of that, the actual mechanism, whereas Albert just kind of was tangential.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, right. There's it has something to say of being the observer of the stuff versus being very much entrenched in the stuff going on. And most of the narratives that do critique it have to do with outsiders coming in and looking at it and being like, yo, this is fucked up, whereas people that were like there doing it day in and day out fully believed in it and didn't understand. In the same way that you get desensitized to anything. If that's your reality, you're gonna be like, no, that was just nice, and now this is boring, sitting in this town doing nothing.
But you also
I get it.
You also can't write a narrative like that about a character that is a part of the system and still make them redeemable. It doesn't translate.
No.
I mean, we can see that, like, if you go read the Alan Quatermain books or something, that's all like the gallant adventure across Africa, and that it's completely tone deaf in the sense that everything we're saying, oh, this was an interesting criticism, oh, this was an interesting examination, that was like, this is great.
Isn't this awesome?
Yeah. This is Hemingway talking about how great nature is while he simultaneously shoots charging rhinos. He's like, nature is amazing, let me kill it.
I love
fully
this
appreciate it.
bathes in the blood. This is awesome. Yes, so that was one of the issues that I had with it. Okay. And again, it was a niggling issue. It wasn't like, this book is dumb. It was just like me being like, I wish that this had tried more or had done a little more with this. And that's just because that's a thing that I'm more sensitive to. I'm sure there are other people that wouldn't even notice or care, really.
And I'd be curious how I would have approached it had I still had all of my post-colonial essay reading as an undergrad, but hadn't read something so close in location and, you know, ship sailing on, you know, South Seas islands and dealing with these same things, that I translated a lot of these scenes into Stevenson's own kind of structure. So I was, I wasn't objectively looking at it as I read it.
Yeah, which is fine too. Reader response, folks. Get an English degree. Yes, so that was a thing that I wanted to chat about. Do you want to chat about the shrunken head in particular? Because you were quite excited about it.
How do we talk about the shrunken head?
I don't know. Lots of people were very traumatized by that shrunken head. Despite
in the book or in life?
No, in the book. Okay. Like the reaction to it when he's like, yo, I found this, and everybody's like,
yeah, they're kind of creepy, Michaela, and those people who saw it were not from, you know, the South Seas. They weren't,
but they are people that
like
have
the casual skull of someone.
Yo, isn't there like that weird church in the Netherlands somewhere that's like filled with skulls? They know what skulls look like.
Oh, okay, see, that's different because shrunken heads don't actually have bones in them. It's all the bones taken out and then the fleshy bits taped together again. Which is
bones.
Gross.
I mean, sure.
These were simple fisher folk and children who were looking at
those children threw a dog off a cliff, but it was a grody old head.
This book down for like a week after that scene.
Oh my god, it was the worst thing. Not only throwing the dog off the cliff, but then being like, smash its skull. And I was like,
they're like, we just need to put it out of its misery right now. Just smash it. It's not working. Smash it harder.
No, I'm like, what?
That was also the only part of this book I didn't fully read. I like
skimmed
for
over
several pages going up to it. I'm like, I don't want to see this.
I was like,
I want to see where this is going. So I just start reading like a sentence by sentence, and then until it's safe again. Then I put it down.
Very detailed, and like that's the thing throughout this book is like how graphic the violence and the gore is. Very detailed.
Like the opening section where it's talking about, you know, the ship to land combat in the Schleswig-Holstein. I'm not very good at German. The Schleswig-Holstein War of between Denmark and Germany, and they're all on the ship, and like that's gross. Getting progressively more drunk.
There was that one guy who didn't die, and just parts of his face was missing, and like his own mother like rejected him, and he was like, "No, I wish I had died."
Yeah, but even during the fight,
the like slipping on people's guts and stuff.
Or just feces in all of their pants.
Literally the description of them all having soil.
Yeah, and it just kept going.
Which, I mean, good on you, really.
Yeah, and that's 100 pages of them being captured and just constantly being drunkened with schnapps to keep them quiet.
Which is fair.
Or at least docile.
I mean, there are worse ways to be captured, I guess. Not
that was a weird way to open a book, Michaela.
It was, but at the same time, I feel like that was one of the
necessary frame for how it ended with World War II. Like,
yes, it needed the like big climax type thing.
It brought the parallels across roughly a century through a lot better than I expected.
Yes, I agree.
Like, even before you have like the random tap dancing guy from Georgia who gets launched into the air and just lands safe a quarter of a mile away or something. There was like a man, it's just boots and tap dancers. They're really good at landing.
Those tap dancers, Wiley.
Yep. They break the surface of the water like a hammer. It's like a pitter-pattering down.
Now I'm just imagining a tap dancer like flapping his way across water.
Like a duck. You know how they with their wing tips they batter the water.
Yeah.
So that was interesting. I don't have anything to say about the shrunken head, honestly. I think it was creepy. I think it was done, and the pearls, the bag of pearls were all done very compellingly. I thought that was possibly the most engaging part of the book for me.
To be fair. Yeah.
Like, that whole voyage was super dark, and from what I do know of Heart of Darkness, I was getting so many vibes around that.
Oh yeah, no.
Yeah. So that was fun, but also the story of Captain Cook is just a fun one. Like, you are not a clever man.
No.
You took some of my stuff. I'm going to abduct the king of Hawaii and think that will go well.
That sounds about right.
Yeah.
But an eye for an eye.
Yeah, you know. Custer had to get the idea from someone. How can I be really dumb when outnumbered and am just super convinced of my superiority because I have white skin?
I got it. Goddamn.
First is a shrunken head forever.
Okay. The other thing I wanted to discuss was the lack of female leads. The only real, like, pretty strong female lead in this was Kara, lady who inherited the ships and then was just like
from Albert.
Yeah, nah, man.
And mother to Nud Eriksson.
Yes.
Yeah.
She was the only one that we really got to see in any capacity, more than just like off shot. Like, they're sad because their husbands keep dying.
Yeah, there were a few women. The, I guess, Chinese woman that Albert knew later in his life. Christina, briefly. And then the Miss, whatever her name, Sophie? Sophie from the end?
I think so.
Yeah, so they show up, but we don't get very much of them. They don't have the chance to do very much. But yeah, Clara Fries we get the most of. And I was really disappointed it was her we got the most of.
Aside from the fact that she was like doing things that I feel like traditionally people from that village, especially women, would not do.
Mhm.
I was like, there are so many other people I would rather be this is a common theme. There are so many other people I would rather be learning more about right now. Not that she was like a terrible character, but I was like, there are so many other women.
I was really frustrated with her arc because I thought the basic idea of her, like, okay, I've lost my husband, I've lost my, sister as a child. My entire town has lost countless men to this ocean. I hate it. I want to just destroy the industry. That's a compelling start. Like, that really worked for me. And in, like, I guess theming, I was all for it. I did have issues along the way, though, that kind of reduced it to not being a very worthwhile arc for me.
Okay.
Like, on one hand, if we're going to say, okay, how can we look at this and what would make it more interesting from, feminist lens, she's just a bad feminist. If this is, okay, she's taking on a traditionally non-female role, you also have those other three women who inherited those things from their husband. And instead of, lifting up those other women or like, working together, she actually had a chance to define the future of the town in, like a way that could say, okay, how can we do it? It was just a really angry and directionless sort of thing. And yes, okay,
It was
we're now discussing plot points.
It was like a
Yes.
petulant child being like, no.
And the further I got into the story, and even at the end of her arc, there's that very sudden realization. She's like, I didn't even, like, it was clear to me that nothing would come of it. Like, we had lost more men to this war than ever to the sea and things like that. And it was just such a shallow resolution where I'm like, I don't see how she could have been following this for 40 years and never really decided to do anything besides, I'm going to buy these ships and not do anything with them.
Yeah.
Like, it fell really far short of what I would have wanted from an actual plot to destroy the town's industry.
Yeah.
In the sense that, more than anything, it just petered out. We spent a lot of time for nothing to happen, and
which is frustrating in an arc. And while that happened a lot throughout this book, I felt like there were some slight pacing issues of like, for character-oriented novels where what you're supposed to be following through the story are these interesting people and like the ways that they're growing rather than like event. You want their growth to have an arc, and I don't feel like her character story had that arc. And that happened a couple of times where like I felt like it kind of like flatlined a little bit.
Yeah.
Which, again, there were moments that were really great, really powerful, really moving, and then just these small little niggling things that were bothersome.
Yeah, like, as a larger narrative, it tied together very well.
Yes.
In terms of individual stories, I'm not looking for actual direct resolution. Like, Lord Madsen paddles off into, the wild blue yonder, and I was okay with that.
Yeah.
That worked, that made sense, and we had that very disappointing but in its own way satisfying from a readerly perspective of Albert going all that way and following all these threads, and it's just an old man sitting in a tree who's then like, well, clearly I'm not far enough off the map yet.
Who's like, going. God damn it, you found me. Fuck off. Yeah. Oh, Lord.
But yeah, things like that would have been nice to see more. On the other hand, it would have been nice to see less of people like, what's his name? The angry old funny was his name by the end. Punchy guy killed his stepfather.
Oh.
Murdered several people along the way and then lost 75% of his limbs.
I know what you're talking about.
I don't know
Oh,
what his name is, but
he's
he was a great threat throughout, and I enjoyed when he showed up because, well, I mostly enjoyed when he showed up because he made interesting reappearances. But we have that whole thing of him like going out onto that city in Spain and having his night run through the town, like sparking off revolution.
Herman.
And it just felt so bizarre in that it happened. I didn't like getting this thrill of the like Eye of the Tiger montage with him running through streets. And then just kind of going back because it just felt like a weird little
His
tangent.
bit in the ending also was a bit weird of an ending for me, because like the end of it with him is that he's sitting in the wet shivering because he has one arm and no other limbs and can't help himself, while everybody else is like reconnecting and stuff, and I'm like, that's just
Yeah, that made sense to me because there was that moment where like, okay, we're not at sea anymore. This is a different situation. These are different rules. This is a different person. And they're like, Nud Erickson is also just like very uncomfortable with that realization where he's like, I kind of started to accept you in your role on my ship, and now you don't serve a purpose here anymore, and I remember that I kind of hate you. And
yeah.
because everyone else here knows who you are. But then they just find him a wagon, and it's, sort of like, okay, you're still sort of a part of this sloppy community that we call family.
Gross. Yeah. I don't know. I think we've been talking for almost an hour. Do you have any other things that you wanted to talk about?
Kind of.
Okay.
If you're okay with that.
Yeah, I'm fine with that.
I'm not sure how much is directly focused.
I mean, if you just want to talk at me, I will make comments based on what you're saying.
Yeah, I also didn't prepare a speech or anything. There was a lot, like, our book club kind of stumbles into a lot of very uncomfortable sex.
Wait, what? You didn't like that Anita Blake book? Are you kidding me?
Actually, that was the healthiest example of sex in a book we've ever encountered.
True. Everybody read Anita Blake. Empowerment to the sexy times.
Like, I was actually totally fine with that. Like, I'm thinking more of like when we read The Magicians, and every book has a really poorly handled moment. I don't think anything in this was directly poorly handled, but there are several moments of rape or very aggressive, not
Sex.
necessarily non-consensual, but certainly not healthy.
What we would call questionable consent?
Questionable consent. Yes, thank you. With Herman, it's pretty clear those are bad, but like Albert in his later chapters has that a lot with Clara Fries, and I never felt satisfied with how it was actually addressed. In that it was like, well, that was a thing and it was over, and I'm like, this. Are we not going to unpack this in any way? Like,
Nah.
you're just gonna throw like brutality and all of that and just assorted grossness and leave it there.
Yep.
And we're just going to keep moving. So I didn't really feel satisfied with a lot of those moments, in that in the same way you felt a lot of the colonial bias language went unexamined, I felt a lot of those scenes did too.
Yeah, I wouldn't say violence against women, but violence against women.
Violence in relations, in carnal relations.
Sure. Yep, sure.
If we wanted to be really generous, we might say, well, these are people that, these are men and women that aren't used to ever living alongside each other. They're always apart, and so there's a lot of
Mm.
untapped aggression. There is not a lot of toxic masculinity or things like that, where people don't deal with emotion or trauma or have healthy family structures and
I
role
mean,
models. So there's
yeah.
so much dysfunction happening in this world that's only kind of, you know,
I literally can't think of any like male and female like relationships where they spend a lot of time with each other and it's not toxic in some way. Because even what's his face, the school teacher that was there his whole life teaching school, it was pretty clearly assumed that either his wife was abusive towards him and his kids, or he was abusive towards her.
It sounded
and then
like
she was abusive towards the kids, or
everyone in that both parents in that family were abusive to each other and to their children. And what was more bothering was that it was a joke. Like, okay, yes, that's framed in such a way that at the time, okay, I can totally understand that. Oh, he's a soft man, let's laugh at him for that. Like, that is a it would have been anachronistic to be confronting that in some ways.
But it was almost framed as if that was supposed to explain why he was such a terrible person, was because he was not manly enough at home, so he needed to like literally beat all of his students.
Yeah. Then again, that was very common.
Yeah.
And as in, it was uncommon not to do that throughout the world in this time period. So I do think, especially looking at those uncomfortable moments as individual things, gets a little messy in that this book is not good at confronting emotions. It's not trying to. I mean, these grand epics, and especially Nordic literature that we've read, very emotionally restrained, very emotionally repressed. When we start to look at it in those larger contexts and compare, like, okay, the school teacher versus Harold, was it?
Yeah.
Who's, he saw, his father went off and died, but then his stepfather, instead of being like a tough hard ass like he wanted, Herman, thank you. I'll never get it right.
No, it's such a normal name that it's just
too
like
normal.
It is. Herman.
When his father was actually trying to be a positive figure, like cared about him and taught him things and like wanted to be a part of his life, he gets really angry about that. And like his entire dysfunction is he never learns to like accept intimacy. Like any sign of compassion was weakness. His mother became a person again instead of a mother, and his stepfather was not a man because he tried to be part of his life instead of just not having a father like normal kids.
Yeah, normal kids. Those dads are either at sea, buried at sea, or
deaf.
And
not a part of the community.
No.
Like they had that whole thing where the boy, who was Ned Erickson's good friend eventually, like he became an anomaly when they realized he had like a really healthy home life. And like his parents are deaf. They're completely isolated from the rest of this culture where they're just like caring about each other and like touching each other.
Whoa!
As a family might. Like hugging.
You're right. They're the only ones. It's because they don't get influenced by the outside world.
Exactly. So I do think it is valuable when you're able to look at it in these larger things and like, oh, you are trying to show a lot of different things, but at the same time,
it wasn't. Yeah, in the same way that this brought up colonialism but didn't really talk about it, it also is bringing up toxic masculinity and the effects that has on the community.
But only in a meta sense. You're not getting those answers from the book, which is okay. Like, that's why this is you know, the sort of thing you'd read in a college class and get more out of, because if you're not then sitting down to unpack the ideas, this isn't going to tell you shit.
No.
It was nice that we got a surprisingly happy ending, even though the heron finally takes its revenge on Boiler Boy, who tried to shoot it.
God
It
damn
is
it.
the harbinger of doom that blows up their steamer in the harbor. That one boy doesn't make it out.
Is it sad that I found that funny?
It was weirdly funny.
Like you were kind of rooting for that herring. Like you felt bad for
Heron. It was not an aggressive sardine.
No, an aggressive sardine. It's funnier that way.
It is.
Sorry.
It is.
Yes.
Yeah.
Heron.
Yeah. Or was it a stork? Are we just completely off base here?
It was waterfowl, and that's all that matters.
Large waterfowl.
Yes.
Yeah. I thought it was surprising how Nud Erickson and Sophie actually have this positive ending. Like, I'm relieved because this story really needed that, in which you have a promise of this adoptive family that is working out.
Yeah.
You know, it's all of these men out at sea who embrace this child, and, you know, instead of being completely absent in these families, and this boy growing without one gets like 13. Gets hauled out of the ocean, grew up on a ship, so it's... I'm not sure I can really read into it. Oh.
Takes a village to raise... Takes a village, something like that.
Takes a village to raise a child. Except in this book, you know, that village is kind of gone. There aren't many people.
No.
Half of them are gone. So, I don't know if we can read it as like, oh yes, the modern era when the steamships were finally even going to be obsolete, and this was no longer a time of boats, then families could be restored, but it kind of was that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or maybe just like, at the end of it, we can finally learn a lesson about ourselves. Destroying boats doesn't work. War is the real enemy. Love the children, even though they're yours.
Nurture.
Yeah. It's not the fault of the ocean, it's the fault of toxic masculinity.
There it is. We solved it. We cracked the code. I don't know.
So those were those are my feelings on sex and family. Thank you for helping me try to... What started out as very simple and was still really weird. Like, you know, don't get me wrong, there were a lot of weird bomb time orgies.
Classic. What else do you do during bomb times?
I mean, it's better than sitting around, I guess.
It is.
But I think in the end, I was just really glad that Miss Sophie and Nud Eric didn't have a really uncomfortable sex scene.
You know, yeah.
Yeah.
They learned that sex is not necessary when sex is always toxic.
Yeah, it was more about the emotional connection that they found.
Yes. And they didn't need to have sex because they had a small bean given to them.
Well, that's not entirely true. It was just at the time it wasn't necessary because she totally is pregnant by the end.
Yeah.
She's like, was it you better not die, or it's a good thing you're not dead because I'm pregnant?
It doesn't really matter. It's either.
Yes.
Yeah. So. Not a bad book. Not the best book ever.
Really interesting book.
Interesting book.
It pairs a lot of history and genre and thoughts while...
And it... Part of me feels like it's one of those books that's making reference to a lot of classics that I haven't read because I don't read Nordic literature. Like, I can see the parallels to something like Heart of Darkness, but which is probably something that is well known there. but I don't read a lot of Nordic literature. I don't read a lot of classics in general.
I mean, he even has
Like
his acknowledgements page.
Yeah.
Because one, he's just thanking his entire town because the author is from Marstal, and he based it roughly off of the history. So he's saying, like, thank you for all the people who were a part of constructing this, but then he's also just got this massive list of periodicals and authors that he took inspiration from and learned from, of just not simply, here's how boats worked over 90 years.
Including, but not limited to, the Odyssey. Some French thing.
Conrad
Yep.
has mentioned in there. So all these things, yes, he's clearly thinking in a much larger context.
Which I think Conrad and maybe the Odyssey are the two that I...
Oh, yeah, like, most of these are just super Danish.
So Danish.
Yeah, it's
Really,
Salmabog til Kirke.
I have no idea.
Things like that. It's
And
Swedish with a potato in your mouth.
yeah, that one.
That's not the translation. That's what Nords, Scandinavians describe Danish as sounding like.
That's fair. What was I gonna say? Oh, and because I know that it's such a complex novel, even with just what I did get, I feel like if I had read more of those texts, I feel like maybe we would be saying something differently, and we wouldn't feel like we were missing things in the same way. Like maybe it was very clearly supposed to be speaking in tangent with these things that we can't communicate. We don't have
inevitable
the knowledge. Yeah.
Holistic literature. Everything's in reference to everything else.
But in particular, translated fiction is going to be in reference to things that we more than likely aren't.
True, we definitely don't have the cultural history of Denmark. But again, I found this to be just historically fascinating because not a country we get much info on, and
Sure.
Even if it's just looking at it during the Second World War, it's just very engaging to get these different narratives.
Yeah.
Completely isolated from the other war stuff.
That's fair.
But yeah, we can kind of talk for another 2 hours of like every small little plot point. I think we've covered, to my satisfaction, my major feelings and what I saw major parts of the book.
Yeah. You could probably write 17 different papers that are like 30 pages long about so many different threads that are woven through this thing.
Let's not get carried away. I think if you were able to get a college class together, you could get 17 papers. I don't think one person should really.
I mean, unless you love
2,000 pages.
Unless you love it. And then do it all. Please do.
Please. You don't need to write 3 times the length of this book in analytics if you don't want to.
If you don't want to.
This isn't a challenge.
Throw down. No, it's okay. So yes, this was the last book in this trio of picks. It was Taylor's pick. Starting hopefully at the end of this month, we will be starting 3 nonfiction picks. Starting with mine, which is Smoke Gets in Your Eyes by Caitlin Doherty, who worked in a crematorium, and it's a discussion not only of her time working there and a bit of a memoir, but also just a general discussion on the West's feelings towards death and very much our insecurities with it and our inability to confront it. Very me book, so I'm excited about it.
Yeah, I'm excited too. It's fun.
Anything else? Follow the Twitters and the socials in the down bar. I am working to get this up as a podcast. It has been solamente videos on online, so hopefully that will boost some community interactions on things like Goodreads and Twitter, because I feel like this format works best. The long talking works best as a podcast rather than a video.
Yeah, I think that's a worthy cause.
Yeah.
So, if nothing else,
Au revoir.
yeah, till next time.
Bye, guys.